The CEO's rushed dismissal of a street musician sparks curiosity. Why ignore him? And what's about to unfold? The morning was a blur of flashing lights, honking cars, and hurried footsteps pounding against the pavement. The city seemed to breathe in chaos and exhale urgency, and I was no exception. My phone buzzed constantly in my pocket, with reminders of back-to-back meetings that would decide the trajectory of multi-million-dollar projects. My assistant had already called twice, urging me not to be late for the most important presentation of the quarter. Every second mattered. Every breath seemed weighed against profits, growth, and reputation. As the CEO of a company that had risen faster than most of my competitors could have imagined, I lived in a world where efficiency ruled, and distractions were seen as weakness. Yet, just as I turned the corner toward the towering glass building where my name hung proudly on the top floor, I heard it. A melody that sliced through the noise of the city like a sudden gust of fresh air in a suffocating room. It wasn't just sound. It was something haunting, something alive, something that seemed to hold a story far deeper than the shallow footsteps rushing by. My eyes instinctively shifted toward the source, and there he was. A man, probably in his late 30s, standing on the cracked sidewalk with nothing more than a battered violin resting on his shoulder. His clothes were worn, his shoes nearly falling apart, and his hair messy from what looked like nights spent under the sky rather than beneath a roof. People walked past him without more than a glance, some tossing a coin into the open violin case, others rolling their eyes at the inconvenience of having to sidestep him. But his music was something else entirely. It wasn't background noise. It wasn't the careless strumming of someone begging for pity. His music carried weight, emotion, and a depth that I couldn't place. Every note sounded like it had been pulled from an old memory, and every vibration seemed to tug at a part of me I thought I had buried beneath years of ambition and ruthless focus. For a moment, my steps slowed. I watched as his bow moved across the strings with precision, yet there was no pretension in his playing. His eyes were half closed, as though he wasn't performing for the crowd but for someone long gone, someone whose absence still burned in his heart. The melody swirled around me, drawing me in like invisible threads I couldn't cut free from. I felt my throat tighten, though I didn't know why. Maybe it was the way the sound seemed to echo in places of me I hadn't visited in years. Maybe it was because, for the first time in a long time, I felt something that wasn't connected to money, power, or progress. But then the sharp buzz of my phone snapped me back into my world. The screen lit up with my assistant's name, her text in all caps. 5 minutes until the meeting starts. My heart rate spiked. Not from the music, but from the reminder of everything I had to lose if I failed to deliver that day. Investors didn't wait. Clients didn't care about excuses. And CEOs certainly didn't stop in the middle of the street to listen to a man scraping out tunes on an old violin. I told myself it was nothing, just noise that had gotten under my skin because I was overtired and overstressed. I shoved my hands into my pockets, turned my gaze away, and picked up my pace. I didn't even throw him a coin, not because I didn't have one, but because doing so felt like an acknowledgement I couldn't afford to give. If I gave him even a second of recognition, I feared it would unravel the armor I had built around myself for years. The kind of armor that didn't allow vulnerability, didn't allow softness, didn't allow a man like me to be swayed by something as intangible as music. I had built my empire by ignoring distractions, and that's what I told myself he was. Just another distraction. Yet, as I reached the edge of the sidewalk and pressed the revolving glass door of my building, I found myself glancing back one last time. His eyes met mine, even for a fraction of a second, and there was something unnerving in that look. It wasn't pleading. It wasn't broken. It wasn't the gaze of someone begging the world for scraps. It was piercing, almost as though he knew me, almost as though he recognized me. I shook my head quickly, telling myself I was imagining it. He was just a stranger, a nameless man on the street who played a song that stirred up unwanted memories. I didn't have time for that, not when my company was counting on me. So I stepped inside, letting the heavy doors close behind me, cutting off the sound of the violin and the strange pull it had cast over me. But as I rode the elevator up, floor after floor climbing toward my office, the music lingered in my head. It was faint, like an echo trapped in the corners of my mind, refusing to fade, no matter how many times I tried to focus on the numbers in my presentation. No matter how tightly I gripped my phone and stared at my notes, the melody kept sneaking back in. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to. It felt dangerous somehow, as though acknowledging it would unravel everything I had worked so hard to control. I straightened my tie, adjusted my jacket, and walked into the conference room with all the confidence I was known for. But behind the practiced smile, behind the firm handshake and the controlled voice, there was still that sound, still that pull. And in the pit of my stomach, an uneasy feeling gnawed at me, whispering that maybe, just maybe, ignoring him had been a mistake. As I stepped into my building, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd see him again. The street musician isn't who he seems. His past holds secrets no passerby could guess. That evening, when the last meeting ended and I returned home to my glass-walled penthouse, I should have been celebrating. The deal I had been preparing for weeks had gone through, investors had shaken my hand with confidence, and the financial reports on my desk confirmed that the company was headed into its strongest quarter yet. On paper, I had every reason to pour myself a drink, loosen my tie, and sink into the leather couch with the smug relief of a man who had conquered his day. But none of that happened, because even as the city lights glittered beneath me and the hum of traffic rose up like a restless ocean, I couldn't stop hearing it. The music. That melody that cut through the noise of the morning was still there, alive in my mind, haunting me in a way no spreadsheet or chart ever could. It was as though the notes had followed me home, weaving themselves into the air of my apartment, refusing to let me rest. And with every repetition in my head, I kept asking the same question. Who was that man? I tried to shake it off. I poured a glass of scotch, stared out over the skyline, and told myself that I was being ridiculous. He was just another street performer, one among thousands who played in subway stations and on sidewalks, hoping for change and scraps of recognition. I had seen them all my life. Why should this one be any different? Why should his music cling to me like a shadow when the world was full of songs I ignored every single day? But this wasn't just sound. There had been something in the way he played, something raw, something broken yet beautiful, as though every stroke of his bow had been carved out of pain. And the strangest part wasn't even the music itself. It was the way he looked at me. That single moment when our eyes met had felt too deliberate, too piercing, too filled with something I couldn't name. Recognition? Resentment? A silent message I was too blind to read? I couldn't let it go. My mind, which usually dissected numbers, market trends, and human behavior with ruthless precision, was now circling endlessly around a single man with a violin. So, against all logic, I began to dig. The next day, I asked one of the security guards outside my building if he knew the musician. He shrugged. He's been playing around here for months, he said, sometimes mornings, sometimes late at night. Doesn't talk much. Doesn't bother anyone. Just plays. That was it. No name, no story. Just a vague outline of a man who seemed to exist and not exist at the same time. Curiosity burned deeper. Over the week, I casually asked a few more people. The coffee vendor at the corner, the receptionist in the lobby, even one of the delivery drivers. Their answers were all the same. They had seen him, they had heard him, but no one really knew him. To the city, he was invisible, like a shadow that drifted in and out of sight, noticed only when the haunting sound of his violin forced people to glance his way. But if he was truly invisible, why did I feel like he had seen straight through me? That thought kept me awake at night. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the city outside, and instead of silence, I would hear his melody. A stranger's song had followed me home, crawling into the corners of my mind and refusing to leave. I told myself it was just stress, just exhaustion. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. One evening, after another long day at the office, I finally gave in to the pull. Instead of heading straight to my building, I lingered near the corner where I had first heard him. And there he was, bow in hand, body swaying with the rhythm, eyes half closed as though the world around him didn't exist. But as the crowd shifted and someone moved aside, his gaze lifted, and once again it locked onto mine. The look hit me like a punch. It wasn't the look of a stranger glancing at a passing face. It was deeper, heavier, filled with something I couldn't read but could feel in my bones. There was no doubt about it. He knew me, or at least, he knew something about me. That moment shook me, because I built my life on control. Control of my company, control of my image, control of every outcome I could possibly predict. Yet here was a man I didn't know. A man society would label a nobody, and he had managed to shatter that control with nothing but a stare and a song. I didn't drop a coin in his case that night either. I didn't speak. I just stood there for a minute too long, then turned and walked into my building with my pulse racing harder than it ever did in a boardroom. And the entire elevator ride up, one thought gnawed at me. Why did he look at me like that? I had built a fortress around my life, layers of glass, steel, and money that kept me untouchable. But somehow this man on the street had slipped through the cracks. And something told me that the melody I couldn't escape wasn't just a song. It was a message. What I didn't know then was that the message wasn't random. The haunting music wasn't just born of passion or struggle. It was personal. And the recognition I thought I imagined in his eyes was real. Very real. Because he wasn't just a street musician. He wasn't a nameless stranger. He was someone with a story that connected directly to mine. I had no idea he was about to step directly into my world. Inside the CEO's empire, pressure, reputation, and pride define every decision. My days blurred together, one folding into the next, stitched by boardroom debates, strategy sessions, and back-to-back calls with shareholders whose expectations were as towering as the skyscraper I worked in. Each morning, before the sun had even begun to warm the city streets, I was already awake, buried beneath reports and projections, my eyes darting across numbers that determined whether our future soared or collapsed. By the time the rest of the city stretched into consciousness, I had already lived through hours of battles no one on the outside could see. Battles fought not with weapons, but with influence, negotiation, and relentless ambition. I had built everything from nothing. Years ago, I was a young man with no pedigree, no safety net, and no one in powerful circles whispering my name with promise. What I had was grit, vision, and a refusal to accept defeat, no matter how many doors slammed in my face, every late night, every early morning, every missed dinner, every burned-out friendship. They all became bricks in the empire I now ruled. The company wasn't just my business. It was the blood in my veins, the proof that I had bent the world to my will. In this world, success wasn't optional. It was survival. The men and women who sat across from me at the negotiating table didn't care about humanity, kindness, or compassion. They cared about profit margins, quarterly growth, and market dominance. To fall behind was to be devoured, and so I sharpened myself into someone who couldn't be devoured, someone who was feared more than respected, someone who always walked into a room already holding the upper hand. That was why, when I saw a street performer on the corner of a busy avenue, I didn't see a man chasing his dream. I didn't see artistry or beauty. I saw background noise, a distraction, a reminder of everything I had fought not to be. In my world, those who stood on sidewalks with open cases were invisible, ghosts passing through the edges of society, while men like me stood tall, commanding the attention of entire industries. But the truth, the one I didn't like to admit even to myself, was that success has a way of blinding you. It tells you that you've earned the right to look down on others, that the higher you climb, the less the voices at the bottom matter. And when you live long enough in that blindness, you start to believe the lie. You start to believe you can measure a man's worth by the size of his office, the cut of his suit, or the balance of his bank account. I wasn't always that man. Once, in the early years, I believed differently. I remembered sleepless nights, where a single act of kindness kept me going, moments where a stranger's words gave me the strength to keep pushing forward. But somewhere along the line, success hardened me. Somewhere along the climb, I traded empathy for efficiency and compassion for control. Maybe that's why the musician's eyes unsettled me so much, because for the first time in years, I felt as though someone was looking at me not as the CEO of a powerful firm, but as a man. Still, I buried those thoughts. I didn't have the luxury of reflection. My calendar dictated my worth, and the world was always watching. Mornings began with urgent emails, afternoons collapsed into marathon meetings, and nights were swallowed by calls to investors scattered across time zones. I was always in motion, never still, never silent. To stop was to risk falling behind, and falling behind was death in my industry. People envied me, admired me, even feared me. But few understood the weight I carried. Few understood the constant pressure of keeping an empire standing. I lived in a glass tower, yes, but it wasn't only the walls that were glass. It was my life. Everyone could see in, judge, analyze, and measure me against impossible standards. My pride wouldn't allow me to stumble. My reputation wouldn't allow me to crack. And so I pressed forward, day after day, carving myself into a machine that didn't falter, didn't break, and didn't stop to notice the music drifting up from the streets below. That night, as I reviewed the next quarter's projections, I felt the old familiar rush of adrenaline, the same one that had carried me through every major victory. But beneath it, there was a hum, a faint echo of violin strings I had tried to silence. I shook it off, focusing harder on the documents in front of me. Business was business. Street music was just noise. At least, that's what I told myself. What I didn't realize was that the walls I had built around my world weren't as unbreakable as I believed. Success had blinded me, yes, but it had also made me arrogant, convinced that I could choose who mattered and who didn't. And arrogance, I would soon learn, has a way of writing its own downfall. The next morning, a surprising call shook my usual schedule. Fate doesn't let go easily. The musician reappears in a setting where he least belongs. The morning began like any other. Yet I should have sensed that something was different, that the air itself carried an edge of anticipation. My assistant had been unusually sharp in her tone, reminding me twice about the importance of the meeting I had scheduled with one of our most critical investors. This wasn't the kind of conversation where you could afford to falter. The investor in question had the power to expand our influence into entirely new markets, or, with a single decision, pull the rug from under us. For days, my focus had been ironclad, rehearsing every possible question, every hesitation, and every persuasive counterpoint I would need to deploy. My suit was pressed to perfection, my words chosen like weapons ready to be drawn, and my mind locked in the game of power I had mastered long ago. The lobby of my building was buzzing that morning, executives shuffling quickly, interns clutching coffee, receptionists juggling calls. I walked through the crowd, nodding at faces that blurred together in the endless machine of corporate life. But then, As I turned toward the private waiting area reserved for high-profile guests, something froze me mid-step. Sitting there, casually, as though he belonged in that space, was a face I recognized. A face I could not mistake. My chest tightened, and for a moment I thought exhaustion was playing tricks on me. The man leaned back in the chair, legs crossed, dressed in a suit that, though modest, carried an elegance that contrasted sharply with the ragged clothes I had seen him in before. But the eyes, those piercing, steady eyes, were the same. The musician. My heart stumbled in its rhythm. For a moment the noise of the lobby faded. The footsteps, the ringing phones, the conversations, all of it drowned beneath the rush of my own disbelief. What was he doing here? Dressed not as a man of the streets, but as someone who had business inside these walls? My mind raced through possibilities, each more confusing than the last. Was it even him? Could I be mistaken? But no, I wasn't mistaken. You don't forget a face that unsettles you to your core. I slowed my stride, almost unwilling to approach. The sight of him there was unnatural, like seeing a ghost sit comfortably at your dinner table. Every instinct told me that this was impossible, that fate was playing some cruel trick. He didn't belong here. This wasn't his world. And yet there he was, waiting, confident, as though he had been expected. I tried to compose myself, adjusting my cufflinks, forcing my expression back into the mask of control I always wore. But the cracks were there. I could feel them. As I drew closer, his eyes flicked up and met mine. Not in surprise, not in recognition of a stranger, but with the quiet assurance of someone who had been waiting. That same look, the one I had seen on the street, burned into me again. It wasn't the gaze of a man who was beneath me, or someone seeking approval. It was the look of an equal, or worse, someone who knew more than I did. I cleared my throat, greeted the investor who stood nearby, and deliberately avoided acknowledging him. If I pretended he wasn't there, maybe I could control the situation. But deep down, a question gnawed relentlessly. Why was he here? The introductions began, formalities exchanged, polite smiles masking sharp calculations. I led the way toward the boardroom, a place I considered my battlefield, a room I always entered with the confidence of a general who already knew the outcome of war. But this time, as the glass doors opened, I felt an unusual unease. And that unease turned to shock when I glanced back and saw him rising from his seat. The musician, no longer ragged, no longer invisible, fell in step with us. His stride was calm, deliberate, as though he had every right to follow. And no one stopped him. No one questioned his presence. Not the receptionist, not the investor, not even my assistant, who was usually alert to the smallest irregularities. To them, he belonged. To them this wasn't strange. But to me, it was as if the world had tilted on its axis. Because the man I had once dismissed as nothing more than a background sound on the street was now walking through the polished corridors of my empire, his steps echoing in the same rhythm as mine. The closer we drew to the boardroom, the tighter my chest grew, my thoughts spiraling with a single realization that I couldn't shake. He wasn't just a musician. He wasn't just anyone. He was someone. And fate, it seemed, had delivered him straight into the heart of my world. Then, he followed us straight into the boardroom. The CEO expects routine business, but an unexpected guest changes the tone of the room. The boardroom had always been my sanctuary, a battlefield where I reigned supreme. Every polished surface, every strategically placed leather chair, every glass panel overlooking the city skyline was part of a stage I had mastered. I had walked into this room countless times before, prepared, armored, confident. It was here that fortunes were made, alliances were secured, and the future of industries was shaped with nothing more than words, numbers, and iron will. Normally, I would enter with the quiet dominance of a man who already knew the outcome. But that morning, as I stepped inside, There was a weight in the air that pressed against me in ways I couldn't ignore. The investors were already seated, their expressions carrying the usual mix of curiosity and skepticism. My team, lined along one side of the table, sat stiffly, their eyes darting between documents and screens, aware of the high stakes at play. The air was thick with tension, the kind I usually thrived on. But today, I felt my pulse quicken, not with the thrill of control, but with an unease I couldn't shake. And then the moment arrived. The door opened again, and he walked in. The man I had last seen on the street corner, bowing his violin like it was an extension of his soul, now carried himself with a different kind of confidence. Gone were the tattered clothes, the worn shoes, the aura of a man invisible to society. In their place was a presence that commanded attention, even in a room full of power brokers. His suit was modest, yet perfectly fitted, his stride measured, his gaze steady. And to my disbelief, he didn't hesitate. He extended his hand to the investors, one by one, shaking theirs with a familiarity that unsettled me to my core. My mind raced. Was this some kind of joke? A trick? How could a man I had dismissed as a street performer move so effortlessly in a space like this? What connection did he have that allowed him entry into a room where even seasoned executives fought for a seat? I glanced at my team, waiting for someone, anyone, to show the same surprise I felt. But no one flinched. My assistant continued taking notes as though this was the most natural thing in the world. The investors smiled at him, engaged with him as though he belonged, as though he had every right to stand among us. The dissonance was dizzying. I felt like I was the only one seeing a ghost while everyone else welcomed a familiar guest. He caught my eye for the briefest moment, and in that instant, the haunting recognition returned. There was no humility in his gaze, no apology for intruding. Instead, there was an unsettling calm, a silent message in the curve of his lips. I am not who you think I am. I tried to anchor myself, adjusting my tie, straightening the papers in front of me, and forcing my expression into the mask of control that had never failed me. But behind the mask, questions clawed at my mind. Who was he? What game was he playing? And why did it feel like I was the only one unprepared for his presence? The meeting began as it always did, with formalities, greetings, the exchange of polite but hollow phrases. Yet, I found it impossible to focus. Every word spoken by the investors blurred into meaningless sound because my attention kept drifting back to him. He sat there, not at the margins of the table, not as an observer, but with a posture of belonging, as though he had been seated there 100 times before. He took notes, engaged in small talk, even laughed at a passing joke from one of the investors. He blended seamlessly, and that was what terrified me most. I had spent years mastering the art of reading people, of knowing who they were within moments, dissecting their motives before they even spoke. But with him, I couldn't place it. The violinist on the street and the man in this room didn't align, yet they were undeniably the same. One moment he was a ghost on the sidewalk, ignored by thousands. The next, he was part of my world, sitting in the very room where decisions that shook industries were made. The air grew heavier as the conversation edged closer to the heart of the meeting. Charts were projected, financials discussed, projections challenged. Normally, I would have been in my element, anticipating every objection, countering with precision, commanding the room with my vision. But my mind kept wandering, circling back to the stranger beside us, the man whose mere presence seemed to unravel my focus. Was he here by accident? A guest of one of the investors? Or was this deliberate? A move orchestrated with purpose? My instincts screamed that nothing about this was coincidence. His calmness, his confidence, his quiet integration into the room. It all spoke of intention. I leaned back slightly in my chair, studying him more closely as the others spoke. His eyes flicked from one person to another, sharp and attentive, absorbing every detail. He wasn't just present. He was analyzing, understanding, and, in some strange way, leading without speaking. It was then that I realized something that unsettled me more than anything else. For the first time in years, I felt out of control in my own domain. The boardroom had always been mine. Yet now, with him here, I felt like a guest, an intruder in a space I had built. The tension knotted in my chest, twisting tighter with each passing second. I wanted answers, but I couldn't ask, not here, not in front of the investors who already expected me to be the unshakable pillar of confidence. To question him, to show uncertainty, would be to reveal weakness, and weakness was a currency I could never afford. And so I waited, my nerves coiled tight, my mind racing through scenarios I couldn't make sense of. The introductions began, and my worst shock was yet to come. The CEO's disbelief grows as the same street musician takes a seat at the polished boardroom table. The introductions began the way they always did. Measured, formal, carefully choreographed to establish hierarchy and respect. The lead investor, a man I had known for years, and whose influence extended into places most business leaders could only dream of reaching, stood to introduce his team. I leaned forward slightly, pen in hand, ready to jot notes and assess each individual, as I had done 100 times before. This was routine. This was familiar ground, or at least it was supposed to be. And this, the investor said, with the ease of a man making a simple introduction, is my new partner. The words barely registered at first. My pen froze mid-stroke, and then he stepped forward, pulling the chair beside him and lowering himself into it with a calm assurance that seemed to mock the storm rising inside me. The violinist, the man from the street corner, the ghost whose music had followed me into my home, into my thoughts, into my very bones. Partner. The word echoed in my head, sharp and heavy. He wasn't here as a guest, or an assistant, or some curious visitor brought along for observation. He was here as an equal, a man with a stake, a man whose voice would carry weight in this room. My chest tightened, each breath a little harder to draw. The polished table in front of me, the walls of glass around us, the skyline stretching beyond. All of it seemed to blur, narrowing until the only thing that felt real was him. The street musician wasn't a nobody. He wasn't an invisible figure scraping melodies for coins. He was someone powerful, someone who belonged in places like this. His eyes found mine again, and there was no mistaking it this time. This wasn't chance. This wasn't coincidence. There was intent in his gaze, a message unspoken but undeniable. I'm not who you thought I was. I never was. I gripped my pen so tightly it nearly cracked, forcing my face into the calm neutrality I had mastered over years of negotiations. Inside, however, panic clawed at me. How had I misjudged him so badly? How had a man I ignored as a shadow on the sidewalk now sat across from me with the authority to alter the very deals I was about to negotiate? He smiled faintly, a controlled curve of his lips, subtle yet piercing. It wasn't the triumphant grin of someone eager to flaunt a hidden identity. It was quieter, sharper, as though he had been waiting for this moment all along, as though every note he had played on that violin was leading to this. The investor continued speaking, his voice a steady current I could barely follow. He spoke of expansion, of new opportunities, of strategies that would strengthen both our interests. Normally, my mind would have been dissecting every detail, noting every advantage and every threat. But now, all I could hear was the echo of a violin, and the rhythm of my own pulse thundering in my ears. He wasn't fidgeting. He wasn't nervous. He sat tall, hands folded loosely in front of him, his posture reflecting the quiet dominance of a man who knew exactly where he stood. It was maddening. This was my domain, my world, and yet he sat there like he had claimed it without effort. As I studied him, Questions tore through my thoughts. Who was he, really? How had he gone from the cracked pavement of the streets to the polished marble floors of this building? What kind of man lived between two worlds so vastly different and with such composure? I remembered the haunting way he played, how his music had unsettled me in ways I couldn't explain. At the time, I had brushed it off as a trick of my emotions, the byproduct of stress and exhaustion. But now, seeing him here, I realized the music hadn't been random. It had been deliberate. Every note, every glance, every moment had meant something I had failed to recognize. The conversation flowed around me, voices rising and falling in a language I usually commanded, but I was no longer leading. For the first time, I felt like an observer in my own boardroom. My authority, my presence, my confidence, all seemed to waver beneath the weight of his quiet intrusion. He finally spoke. Not to me, not yet, but to the investors, his voice smooth, steady, carrying a depth that demanded attention. It was a voice I hadn't expected, refined and articulate, the kind of voice that belonged in this world as much as any of us. He spoke of markets, of innovation, of opportunities that others had overlooked. He wasn't fumbling, wasn't searching for words. He knew exactly what he was talking about. Each word he spoke chipped away at the disbelief I clung to. He was intelligent, he was capable, and worse, he was respected. The investors nodded, engaged, leaning toward him as though drawn to his insight. He wasn't just here. He was winning them. I sat in silence, hiding the chaos inside me behind a mask of composure. My mind fought to reconcile the two versions of him, the man on the street with his violin and the man before me now. And somewhere deep within me, an unease grew heavier with each passing second. Because if he had managed to appear in my world with such precision, then this wasn't chance. This was personal. The meeting paused briefly as papers were shuffled, glasses of water poured, and in that moment of quiet, he turned fully toward me. His eyes locked on mine, unblinking, holding me in place as though the entire room had fallen away. And then he leaned forward, folding his hands, preparing to speak again. This time, directly. Then he began to speak, and revealed his true identity. What the musician reveals about himself forces everyone to rethink their assumptions. His voice broke the silence, and though it wasn't loud, it commanded the room in a way I hadn't anticipated. It was calm, steady, deliberate, and it carried a weight that drew every ear toward him. There was no strain in his tone, no hesitation, no tremor of a man who felt out of place. Instead, it was the voice of someone who belonged, someone who knew exactly what he was about to do and how carefully it had been planned. "I suppose some of you might wonder why I'm here," he began, glancing briefly around the table, though his eyes kept returning to me, sharp and unwavering. "Most of you have known me by name, by reputation, perhaps even by a few stories whispered in meetings, but I imagine one or two of you may know me differently." My stomach tightened at the way he said it, pointed, precise, like a blade slipping between ribs. I sat frozen, my face schooled into neutrality while inside, every nerve screamed. He leaned back slightly, his hands folded on the polished table. "I'm not, by profession, a musician. That part of me was never supposed to be permanent. Once, I was a rising name in the business world. Some even believed I would lead a firm that would stand shoulder to shoulder with giants." He smiled faintly, but it wasn't a smile of pride. It was one of irony, even bitterness. "But life has a way of stripping away everything you build, doesn't it? It takes without warning. It leaves you with nothing but yourself. And when you have nothing, you find out who you really are." The room was silent. Even the investors, men and women not easily rattled, leaned closer, their interest caught. I tried to look unbothered, but my pulse thudded violently in my throat. I had dismissed him as a street performer, someone beneath the notice of men like us. But here he was. his words cutting through the air like a scalpel, forcing all of us to listen. He continued, his tone even but his eyes alive with an energy that unsettled me. I lost everything once. My company, my family's stability, the life I had been building piece by piece. It all crumbled. Not because I lacked vision or discipline, but because one decision from the wrong person toppled it all. And so I disappeared. To the world, I was finished. Another failure washed away by the tide of business. He paused, his gaze sliding toward me for the briefest second, and I felt the blood drain from my face. There was something in that look, something that suggested his story wasn't just a tragedy, but a tether, a thread that tied directly to me. But here's the thing about losing everything, he said softly, almost as though he were confessing something to himself. It frees you. You stop caring about appearances, about judgment, about the expectations of those who never cared about you in the first place. I chose to return in a way no one expected. I picked up my violin, not because I wanted to be seen as a beggar, but because it gave me something others couldn't control. Freedom, expression, a way to watch the world without being noticed. The investors exchanged looks, unsettled but curious. One of them shifted in his chair, adjusting his glasses. And that's what you were doing? Playing music on the streets? The man nodded slowly. Yes. But the music was more than notes. It was a way of waiting, of testing, of observing who paid attention and who didn't. Because music tells you something about people. The ones who walk past without a glance, the ones who sneer, the ones who stop, even for a moment. You learn what they value without them saying a word. A chill ran down my spine. His words weren't abstract. They were targeted. I could feel them burrowing beneath my skin, pointing directly to me without saying my name. And sometimes, he added, his voice tightening ever so slightly, you find the people who define themselves by what they can ignore. That sentence landed like a blow. My grip on my pen faltered. I knew what he meant, and I knew it was aimed at me. I remembered the day on the corner, how I had brushed him aside without a second thought, how I had convinced myself that listening to him was beneath me. And now here he was, forcing me to face the very arrogance I had clung to as a shield. But he wasn't finished. He straightened slightly, his voice sharpening, his tone now carrying a conviction that made the room lean in even closer. You see, I wasn't playing for coins. I wasn't playing for survival. I was playing to see who people really were when the world wasn't watching, to see who understood the value of something they couldn't own, couldn't profit from, and to see who turned away, blind to what was in front of them. The silence in the boardroom was suffocating. Every face around the table was fixed on him. My team shifted uncomfortably, the investors held their breath, and I sat frozen, the weight of his words pressing down harder than any business negotiation ever had. Then his eyes locked onto mine again. Steady, unblinking, burning with something that felt less like accusation and more like inevitability. The faint smile returned, the same one I had seen on the street when I first ignored him, the same one that had haunted me ever since. And then, with deliberate calm, he leaned forward, his voice lowering into something heavier, more personal. And then he revealed something personal, connected to me. The CEO learns that their lives have been intertwined long before this meeting. His words shifted, and suddenly the tone of the room changed. Until now, he had spoken broadly, sharing the arc of his story in a way that could apply to anyone who had tasted failure and clawed back from it. But now his voice grew heavier, slower, and his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made it clear. This was no longer a general confession. This was directed at me. There was a time, he began, his fingers tapping lightly against the table as though marking the rhythm of an old memory, when my family owned a small but promising company. We weren't giants, not by any stretch of the imagination, but we had built something real, something sustainable. We had loyal employees, clients who believed in us, and a dream that maybe, one day, we'd break through into the larger markets. For us, it wasn't about empire. It was about survival, about dignity, about making sure our name meant something. I felt a prickle along the back of my neck, an unease that grew with every syllable. His eyes never left mine, and though he hadn't spoken my name, the weight of his gaze was undeniable. My throat grew dry, and I shifted in my chair, though I forced my face into neutrality. The investors glanced between us, sensing a current flowing beneath the surface that they didn't yet understand. But then, he continued, his voice tightening, a deal was made. A decision that may have looked like nothing on paper to the one who signed it, but it was everything to us. One contract, one acquisition, one sweeping move from a company much larger than ours. It crushed us. Overnight, the foundation we had built crumbled. Our clients were stripped away, our name was erased, and the people who had trusted us were left jobless. Everything my family had poured into that business disappeared. My chest constricted. A dull, heavy realization began to crawl through me like a slow-burning fire. I knew this story, or at least I recognized the shadow of it. Years ago, early in my career, I had signed off on a deal that absorbed a smaller firm, one I barely remembered by name. It had been a stepping stone for my company, a minor acquisition that cleared the path for us to expand into a sector we hadn't yet dominated. At the time, I had thought little of it. Just another line on a contract, another win to mark in the long march toward success. I had never stopped to consider what it meant for the people on the other side. And now, sitting across from me in a suit that disguised his scars but not his resolve, was the face of that consequence. That company, he said, his voice low, deliberate, almost vibrating with restrained emotion, was my family's. My father had built it from scratch. My mother worked, alongside him, day and night, pouring everything they had into it. I was young, ambitious, and already preparing to take the reins, to grow it further. But one decision, your decision, wiped us out. The words hit me like a strike to the chest. My grip on the pen faltered, and for a moment I forgot to breathe. I wanted to deny it, to argue that it wasn't personal, that it was business, that these things happened in the natural order of competition. But looking into his eyes, I couldn't summon the words. Because deep down, I knew the truth. He was right. I remembered that deal, the way it had been presented to me as an easy acquisition, a chance to clear the field of small competitors. I hadn't hesitated. I hadn't even looked into the details of who ran that company, of what it had meant to the people who lived by it. To me, it had been a line item. To him, it had been everything. The silence in the room was suffocating. Investors glanced at one another, their brows furrowed, sensing the gravity of what was being revealed. My team shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene or remain silent. But I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I was face to face with the living embodiment of a past I had buried beneath numbers and profit margins. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes sharp, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Do you understand what it feels like to watch everything you've ever known collapse because of a man you've never even met? Do you know what it's like to see your family broken, your name erased, your future stolen? All because someone at the top decided we were expendable? I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my heart hammering in my chest. I had always believed that the sacrifices made in business were just part of the game, that losses were inevitable, and those who fell simply weren't strong enough to survive. But sitting across from him, I could no longer hide behind that cold philosophy. Because this wasn't theory. This was flesh and blood. This was pain I had caused, staring me in the eye. For a long moment, I said nothing. The weight of the truth pressed down on me, heavier than any deal I had ever signed, any empire I had ever built. And for the first time in years, I felt small. His voice softened, but the intensity remained. So when you saw me on the street corner playing my violin, you didn't see a stranger. You saw the man you had already broken. You didn't recognize me because, to you, I was just another face, another casualty of the climb. But I recognized you. I never forgot the man whose signature had ended everything. My breath caught in my chest. The violin, the haunting music, the piercing stare, it all made sense now. It hadn't been random. It had been deliberate. He had been watching, waiting, carrying his story like a wound carved deep into his soul. And I had walked past him as though he were nothing. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, to explain, but no words came, because no defense would matter. The truth hung heavy in the air, undeniable and sharp. And then, as though the tension hadn't already reached its breaking point, he leaned back in his chair, his expression calm once more. His faint smile returned, but this time it wasn't bitter. It was something else, something unsettling. "Still," he said, his voice steady, "I didn't come here for revenge. I came here with an offer." And then he made me an offer I couldn't believe. The musician turns the tables, offering something the CEO desperately needs but can't buy. For a long moment after his revelation, the room was silent. No one spoke. No one moved. The investors sat frozen, their expressions shifting between curiosity and discomfort, while my team avoided my gaze, as though afraid that even eye contact with me might drag them into the storm. My own heart thudded heavily in my chest, a slow, painful rhythm that reminded me of how fragile my control suddenly felt. And then he leaned forward, breaking the silence with words I never could have predicted. "I didn't come here to humiliate you," he said, his tone calm but unwavering. "I didn't come here to tear you down, though God knows I've had every reason to dream of it. I came here because I believe in rebuilding. I came here because I have something new, something that matters, and I want you to be a part of it." For a second, I thought I had misheard him. My mind scrambled to make sense of it. After everything he had revealed, after laying bare the ruin my decision had caused him, after showing me the ghost of the destruction I had left behind, he was offering me a deal? My pride bristled instantly. Deals were my territory, my domain. I was the one who extended offers, who dictated terms, who decided who was worthy of my investment and who wasn't. Yet, here he was, the man I had once ignored on the street, the man whose family I had unknowingly destroyed, sitting across from me in a boardroom I had claimed as my fortress, and turning the tables. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked carefully, my voice even, though inside I burned with a mix of anger, guilt, and disbelief. He didn't flinch. "I've built something new," he said, "not from comfort, not from privilege, but from ashes. A company designed differently, structured differently, with lessons carved into its foundation from everything I lost. And now it's growing. It has potential. More than potential. It has vision. But vision isn't enough. I need resources. I need leverage. I need someone who understands the scale of what I'm aiming for. That's why I'm here. That's why I want you." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. Of all the possibilities I had feared walking into this meeting, this was not one of them. I had expected anger, maybe even revenge. But this was worse in a way, because it forced me to look inward, forced me to confront not only what I had done but also what I was willing to do now. The investors leaned forward with interest, their skepticism now shifting toward curiosity. They wanted to hear more. They wanted to see where this was going. And though my pride screamed against it, I couldn't ignore the flicker of something inside me, something dangerously close to respect. "Why me?" I asked finally, the words heavier than I intended. "After everything, why come to me?" His eyes locked onto mine, sharp and unyielding. "Because you owe me. Because whether you admit it or not, part of what you've built was stolen from what I lost. You walk around in the shadow of a choice that destroyed my family. And now, I'm giving you the chance to do something different. To rebuild, not just for me, but for yourself." His words cut deeper than I wanted them to. My pride resisted, screaming that I owed no one anything, that business was business, that the past was the past. But deep down, buried beneath layers of arrogance and ego, I knew he was right. I had taken something from him, even if unintentionally. And though I had justified it to myself at the time, seeing him now, alive with conviction and stronger than ever, I couldn't deny the truth any longer. "I want your investment," he said finally, his voice steady. "Not in my music, not in charity, in my company. I want your name attached to it. I want your influence behind it. And I want you to take responsibility, not just with words, but with action." The room was suffocating. I could feel the eyes of every investor on me, waiting to see how I would respond. My team shifted nervously, sensing that this was no ordinary negotiation. And inside me, a storm raged. Part of me wanted to laugh, to dismiss him, to remind him that he had no right to dictate terms to me in my own boardroom. Another part of me wanted to lash out, to cut him down with the ruthless efficiency that had carried me this far. But beneath it all, another voice whispered something far more dangerous. "You need him." It was true. In recent months, cracks had begun to form beneath the surface of my empire. Deals were becoming harder to close, competitors were circling, and innovation felt just out of reach. Investors had begun to question whether I still had the edge, whether I still carried the vision that once made me unstoppable. I had buried those doubts beneath confidence and bravado, but sitting across from him, I knew. He had something I didn't, something I couldn't buy, and that realization terrified me. I leaned back, my hands tightening against the arms of my chair, fighting the urge to show how unsettled I truly was. His challenge wasn't just about business. It wasn't just about investment. It was about pride, redemption, and whether I had the courage to admit that I had been wrong. The silence stretched, heavy and unbearable, until finally he broke it once more. "So," he said softly, but with unmistakable power. "What will it be? Will you turn away again, like you did on the street? Or will you face what you owe, and do something different this time?" His words landed like a hammer, reverberating through the boardroom, through my chest, through every fragile piece of armor I had built around myself. I wanted to answer, but my tongue felt heavy, my mind split between pride and conscience. I had to respond, but every option carried risk. Tension builds as pride and vulnerability collide. Who will yield first? The weight in the room pressed against me from every angle. The air itself felt heavier, as though it carried the collective breath of the investors who were waiting, watching, dissecting every flicker of expression on my face. My palms itched, my jaw tightened, and my chest burned with the weight of expectation. Pressure mounted with each passing second, the kind of pressure I had always thrived under. But this was different. This wasn't the pressure of numbers or markets or strategy. This was personal, raw, exposed. My reputation was on the line. My ego was on the line. And more than that, my legacy trembled in the balance. Every deal I had ever struck, every empire I had ever built, every step of the climb I had made, it all seemed to teeter now on the edge of this single moment. Because it wasn't just a business decision being demanded of me. It was a reckoning. He sat across from me, calm, composed, his gaze steady and unyielding. He didn't fidget, didn't sweat, didn't falter. His confidence wasn't loud or overbearing. It was quiet, assured, the kind of confidence that didn't need to prove itself. And that unsettled me more than anything else. Because I had spent my entire life proving myself, showing the world I was worthy of the place I stood. Yet here he was, a man who had once been broken, staring at me as though he had already won. The silence in the boardroom was unbearable. Every tick of the clock echoed like a hammer. The investors glanced between us, their curiosity sharpening into expectation. They could smell the tension, feel the electricity crackling in the air. This wasn't just business to them anymore. This was theater. This was blood. This was the kind of moment that decided who stood tall and who crumbled. I tried to summon the voice that had never failed me, the one that had carried me through hostile negotiations, ruthless acquisitions, and battles that left competitors in ruins. I tried to summon the part of me that had built an empire on sheer willpower and control. But for the first time, the words refused to come. Because deep inside, I wasn't just negotiating with him. I was negotiating with myself. Pride screamed at me to reject him, to remind him of who I was, to cut him down with cold efficiency, to remind him that I didn't bow to anyone. Pride demanded I preserve the image I had built, the image of a man untouchable, unshakable, unmovable. But another voice whispered beneath the pride. It was quieter, but it was relentless. It reminded me of the truth, that I had wronged him, that my ambition had left scars I had never acknowledged, that my empire was built not only on victories, but on the rubble of people like him. That voice whispered of redemption, of change, of the possibility that maybe, just maybe, my legacy could be rewritten if I dared to choose differently now. The two voices collided inside me, pride and vulnerability locked in battle. And as they clashed, the investors grew restless. One cleared his throat, another shifted in his chair. I saw the flicker of doubt in their eyes, doubt not in him, but in me. For the first time, they wondered if I was faltering, and that was a thought I couldn't bear. My chest tightened further, every muscle in my body straining against the silence. My lips parted, ready to speak, ready to force the decision out of me even if it wasn't fully formed. The words were there, tangled and sharp, desperate to break free. But before I could speak, before I could reclaim the control I felt slipping from my grasp, he moved. He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the table, his eyes never leaving mine. And then, with the calmness of a man who had orchestrated this very moment, he interrupted me. My lips parted, but before I could speak, he interrupted me. A revelation shatters the CEO's certainty, pushing him to confront his own past mistakes. He leaned forward, his expression steady, his voice calm, but what he said next shattered the fragile wall of defenses I had built inside myself. "I need you to understand something," he said, his tone carrying no anger, no bitterness, only a steady resolve that somehow felt heavier than fury. "I never wanted revenge." The words struck me harder than if he had shouted accusations, harder than if he had demanded my downfall. For weeks, I had been bracing myself for vengeance, for some elaborate plan designed to humiliate me, expose me, or crush me in the same way my decision had once crushed his family. But to hear him speak of revenge with such quiet dismissal, it disarmed me completely. "I could have sought it," he continued, his voice carrying through the room with deliberate precision. "I could have found ways to sabotage you, to drag your name into the mud, to make you feel what I felt when everything I cared about was taken. But I didn't. Because revenge doesn't build. It only destroys. And I promised myself that if I ever got the chance to confront the man behind that decision, I wouldn't waste it tearing him down. I would test him instead. I would see if he had the courage to be more than the man who once ignored me." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Even the investors, who had sat through thousands of negotiations, mergers, and betrayals, seemed stunned. My team glanced at one another nervously, uncertain of what this revelation meant for me, or for the company. I sat rigid, my heart hammering, my thoughts colliding like waves in a storm. He never wanted revenge. The street performance, the haunting music, the piercing gaze, it hadn't been desperation or coincidence. It had been a test, a deliberate, orchestrated test of character. And I had failed. The memory of that day on the street came rushing back, sharper than ever. The way I had brushed past him, refusing to acknowledge the humanity in front of me, dismissing him as nothing more than noise. At the time, I had convinced myself it was efficiency, focus, the necessary blindness of ambition. But now I saw it for what it was. Arrogance, indifference, the coldness of a man who had allowed success to calcify his soul. My chest ached with the weight of that realization. I had failed him, yes, but more than that, I had failed myself. But, he said softly, his eyes narrowing as though he could see the storm inside me, failure doesn't have to be final. You ignored me once, but now you have the chance to prove who you really are. Not to me, not to them, but to yourself. The words cut deeper than any accusation could. They weren't a condemnation. They were a challenge, a chance. I looked around the room. The investors were watching closely, their faces unreadable but their interest undeniable. My team waited tensely, their loyalty tied to the image of strength I always projected. And across from me sat the man I had underestimated, the man I had once broken without even knowing, the man who now held up a mirror and forced me to see the cracks in myself I had long ignored. I had spent my life building an empire out of discipline, sacrifice, and relentless ambition. I had prided myself on control, on never bending, on never allowing anyone to dictate my path. And yet here I was, my certainty shattered, my pride battered, my future teetering on the edge of a choice I never expected to face. My breathing grew heavy as the truth pressed down harder. This wasn't about business anymore. This wasn't about profit margins or market expansions. This was about who I was when stripped of the titles, the money, the power. This was about whether I would continue to be the man who ignored, or whether I could become something different. For a long moment, I said nothing. My hands clenched against the table, my jaw tight, my throat dry. Inside me, pride and fear fought viciously against the flicker of something I hadn't felt in years: humility. Finally, he leaned back slightly, giving me space, his gaze never softening but his voice steady as he delivered the final strike. This isn't just about my company. It isn't just about investment. It's about you. You have a choice. You can be the man who pretends this moment never happened, who walks away to preserve his pride. Or you can be the man who admits that mistakes don't have to define the rest of his story. The room felt like it was closing in on me. My mind swirled with memories of the climb, of sacrifices made, of victories won, of people lost along the way. I thought of the man I had once been, hungry and desperate, clawing my way upward, fueled by dreams rather than arrogance. I thought of how far I had drifted from him. And then I thought of the street, the haunting melody, the piercing eyes, the moment I had turned away without a second glance. That moment had defined me once, but it didn't have to define me forever. I took a deep breath, my lips parting, the weight of the decision pressing down on me like a mountain. I knew, with crystal clarity, that whatever I chose in the next few moments would determine not just the fate of the company, not just the trajectory of my career, but the very core of who I would become. My decision would determine both our futures. The final twist delivers not just closure, but a lasting moral that resonates beyond the story. I took a deep breath, the kind that felt as though it reached places inside me I hadn't touched in years. My chest ached with the weight of it, but also with something else. Something lighter, freer, though terrifying in its own way. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about profits, projections, or the numbers that dictated my every move. I was thinking about people, about choices, about the kind of man I wanted to be when all of this was over. And in that silence, in the eyes of investors who waited for me to reclaim the power I had always carried, I chose differently. "I'll do it," I heard myself say. My voice was steady, though my hands trembled beneath the table. "I'll invest. Not just in the numbers, not just in the structure of your company. I'll invest in you, in what you're building, in what I should have seen before." The words surprised even me. But once they were out, I felt a strange release, as though something inside me had finally unclenched after years of being locked tight. His eyes met mine, and for the first time since this began, there was a flicker of something new in his gaze. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't satisfaction. It was something closer to acknowledgement. Respect, perhaps, or maybe forgiveness. Whatever it was, it struck me deeper than any victory I had ever celebrated. The investors murmured among themselves, some skeptical, some intrigued. But their voices were background noise now. What mattered was that I had stepped outside of myself, outside of the armor I had worn for years, and taken a risk that wasn't measured in dollars or strategy. It was measured in humility. The deal that followed wasn't simple. It wasn't the kind of clean acquisition I was used to, where I consumed and absorbed until there was nothing left of the other side. It was a partnership, a true partnership, where I had to learn to listen, to yield, to share vision instead of dictating it. It was uncomfortable at first. My pride bristled, my instincts rebelled. But with every passing day, I realized something I had long forgotten. Success doesn't mean crushing others beneath you. Sometimes success means lifting others beside you. Together we built something extraordinary. His ideas, born out of ashes and pain, carried a raw authenticity that no corporate strategist could replicate. My resources, my influence, my experience, they gave his vision the platform it needed to rise. And side by side, against every odd, we created a company that mattered. Not just for profit, but for people. Not just for growth, but for meaning. In time, the investors who once doubted me praised the decision. The market that once questioned my edge celebrated the innovation we brought. But none of that compared to what I gained in silence when no one was watching. Because for the first time in years, I felt human again. I felt like the young man I had once been, hungry not for power, but for purpose. The violin never disappeared from his life. Some nights, after long days of strategy and work, he would take it out again, standing by the window of his office as the city stretched before us, and he would play. And when he did, I listened, not with impatience, not with dismissal, but with reverence. Because I knew now that music had been his truth, his test, his way of showing me what I had refused to see. Through him, I learned the lesson I had been blind to all along, that success means nothing if you lose your humanity along the way. Money can build towers, power can bend markets, but only humanity can build something that lasts, something that truly matters. Years have passed since that day, but the memory never leaves me. The sight of him on that street corner, the haunting melody of his violin, the way I walked past without a thought, it is carved into me like a scar. And though I have changed, though I have chosen differently since, that moment still lingers as a reminder of who I almost became forever. And to this day, I still wonder, what if I had walked past him twice? If this story made you stop and think about how small choices can change lives, then don't just leave it here. Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you would have done in my place. Make sure to hit that like button if you enjoyed the journey, and subscribe so you never miss the next story that might just shift your perspective. And remember, sometimes the people we overlook have the most powerful lessons to teach us.